If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this. People, what is your scariest encounter with the cryptids, aliens, and other unexplainable phenomena? I heard my voice whisper in my ear. It was like 2 a.m. and terrifying. I suddenly felt just a heavy malicious presence that I had to hide before. Like a half an hour before I got the courage up to run to my room, I was on the computer downstairs. Eventually, like a week later, I convinced myself I had just been hearing things, and then it happened again. The same thing, a male voice inches from my left ear. It didn't happen again after that, and I once more forced myself to think I made it up. While I believe in the paranormal, I would prefer not to have that happen, until about a year later, when I casually mentioned it to my mother, and she told me she also heard a male voice whispering my name downstairs. I don't live in that house anymore, and while I miss the house itself, I do not miss whatever the hell that was. I live in the upper Panhandle area of Oklahoma and have seen a lot of weird stuff in my days, some of which other family members can attest to. One such weird thing would be a shadow creature I see when with my uncle in the countryside. Oklahoma once housed Indian tribes, and the remnants of these still remain. One of their legends tells about a shadow creature who will suck your soul from your body if you don't leave your shoes by the trees while camping. Personally, I've never been camping, so I wouldn't really know about that, but I have seen shadowy figures and heard unexplained rustling and scurrying, and sometimes noises around me stop when seeing these entities. I'm wondering if anyone else knows anything about this. Whether this is exclusive to Oklahoma or if anyone else has had these experiences in other areas. I don't really know what these figures or beings could be, but I do believe sacred Indian ground has some pull when it comes to supernatural beings and occurrences. I live in a small forest town, technically a village, in Massachusetts, just north of Boston. The elementary school had this event every fall called the Fall Fundown. There's always food and shit, and the kids run around outside. Anyways, my friend, who's a couple years older than me, told me how, like, 5 years ago, this girl wandered off into the woods by the baseball field behind the school. Those woods are huge, and she was in there for like hours. Nobody knew where she went, and there was a mini panic. When she finally came out, she was crying and couldn't talk about what happened. She literally hasn't been the same since, not even now in high school. She changed in a huge way, dude. So, there have been 2 sightings of a strange creature scampering up a tree and disappearing. One, by that same friend on his own a couple years ago in the same woods the girl got lost in. He described a dog-looking creature with primate arms. It climbed up a tree super quick, and he couldn't find it again. A couple months ago, I was walking in some nearby woods with my friends, and we saw this massive whitish-gray blur run up a tree and disappear. It was way bigger than any squirrel or something we could have mistaken it for, and we thought it looked doggish. That was before I heard the stories from my other friend. We always hear howling in both wooded areas, which is probably coyotes, but it kind of makes you wonder, you know. I'm very, very sure there's something out here, but I have no idea what it could possibly be. Definitely not someone's pet or a lone coyote. Green-skinned children. In Suffolk, England, sometime in the 12th century, the villagers of Woolpit discovered 2 children, a brother and sister, beside one of the wolf pits that gave the village its name. Their skin was green, they spoke an unknown language, and their clothing was unfamiliar. It is said that the children were taken to the home of Richard Decon. Both children refused all food for several days until they came across some raw beans, which they consumed eagerly. The children gradually adapted to normal food and, in time, lost their green color. The boy, who appeared to be the younger of the 2, became sickly and died shortly after he and his sister were baptized. After learning to speak English, the surviving girl explained that they came from a land where the sun never shone and the light was like twilight. She said they called their home St. Martin's Land and that everything there was green. The children were unable to account for their arrival in Woolpit. They had been herding their father's cattle when they heard a loud noise and suddenly found themselves by the wolf pit where they were found. When I was a very little girl, my mother said I had imaginary friends and that things used to move around the house sometimes. We also used to get lightning fireballs that would travel from the refrigerator over to the stove and up the flue during big storms, but I'm thinking this might just have been hinky wiring. This was in Springfield, Missouri. But when we moved to my mother's hometown in NW, Missouri, I'd have very vivid dreams of little brown, long-limbed people with very dark almond-shaped eyes and skin that looked like leather. They'd come to me in my dreams and take me around our little town and show me caves and springs and buildings that did not exist in my waking world but which they told me had either existed at one time, had been planned to exist, or had been dreamt of but never brought into being. I thought of this as a parallel town. These people seemed to live in the hills, caves, and trees themselves. I can remember asking my mother, who was of the 4th generation in this town, if this mill or that building had ever existed. On 3 occasions, she'd said that they had either burned down or been torn down, and asked me how I knew about them because they'd come down in the previous century. When I told her what the little brown people in my dreams told me, she clammed up. There's a documented story of a boy in the 1800s who came upon a man in the forest who invited him over to dinner with his family. He went to dinner and met everyone, a friend of his family included, and had an enjoyable meal and evening. He ended up falling asleep there, got up in the morning, and had the man walk him halfway home. Right after the man left him, the family friend he saw at the house came upon him. He was part of a search party, and they had been searching for him for days, I believe. He turned around, and it was just a forest. No house, no man, no family, and no family friend. He had just spent the evening in a house with a family that didn't even exist. Pretty wild stuff. I think I'd go insane if something like that ever happened to me. When my girlfriend was 17 and I was 18, she lived out in the country with her parents, and when it snowed badly, she would have to park about a quarter mile away in her grandfather's driveway as her 2WD Pontiac couldn't make it through the hill on her own driveway. One night in early February, after a particular nasty snowstorm, she was driving home and noticed an odd light in the sky. She thought nothing of it and kept on driving, eventually arriving at her grandfather's. This is when shit got weird. I look down at my phone and see that I've missed about 7 consecutive calls from her. I called her back, and she answered immediately in a state of panic. She was talking about how she saw a light in the sky, and even though she was now parked and her keys were out of the ignition, her dash lights, headlights, and radio were going totally haywire, and over the radio was nothing but white noise. I could hear the radio over the phone. I of course told her it was nothing to be worried about, probably just a battery issue, when she got really quiet. She said she saw a figure at the end of the driveway. I again wrote it off and said it's probably just the mailbox. That's when she screamed. The figure had moved in seemingly a blink of an eye from the end of the 60-foot or so long driveway to about 30 feet away. She screamed again when she noticed it was slowly moving towards the driver door. It got about 10 feet away from the driver door, and there was a flash of light, and it vanished. I asked her to describe the figure. She said it was roughly 7 feet tall, skinnier than any human should be, with long arms that hung down to its knees. She described the head as being almond-shaped and was, for some reason, adamant that it was almond and not elliptical. She got out of her car and made a break for her house, running through snow and ice while on the phone with me. She screamed again. She eventually made it to her house and ran to her room. She said when she was running, there was a massive flash of light behind her, and there was a searing pain in her calf. Very freaked out, she went to bed. The next day, I messaged her in the morning and said something along the lines of "Lol, so did you make it through the night without being abducted?" She responded with something along the lines of, "Yeah? What do you mean?" I told her what happened. She didn't believe me at all. She thought I was messing with her. She had and still has no recollection of the night's events. Every record, phone calls and texts, of our conversations the night before were gone from her phone. She only believed me when I screenshotted our conversation on my phone after she hung up and sent it to her, and I showed her all the phone call records still on my phone. I remember what she told me about the burning sensation in her calf and told her to check it, and lo and behold, there's a really nasty red mark on it. Could this have been an alien? If it wasn't, what else could have gone down? When I was in middle school, I used to spend Friday nights with my cousin. One night I jumped out of bed when I heard my little cousin crying, maybe 5 at the time. When I went to see what was wrong, he told me they wouldn't stop taking her at night. I was confused, but I got him to stop crying and calm down a bit. He told me that every night the little, scary-looking gray people would come take his mom. I was confused but shrugged it off, got him back to sleep, and did the same. The next day, I told his mom what happened, and apparently he did that quite often. It can probably be explained, but that always scared the shit out of me. This happened to me about 2 years ago. I live in northwestern GA and decided to go camping a couple miles from my house. Everything was normal until I went to sleep. About 3 in the morning, I was awoken to the sound of metal grinding metal and rock grinding rock. I could hear each noise simultaneously and clearly. It sounded like it was right on top of me, and I also felt extremely heavy. I could not move an inch or make a sound. This went on for about half an hour. After it stopped, I waited for another half hour, grabbed my gun, 12 gauge, and my spotlight, and poked my head out of the tent to see just what the hell had happened. Everything seemed normal other than the heavy feeling that, like someone had turned up the gravity, everything even looked heavy. I laid back down and went to sleep after that. The next morning, when I got out of my tent, I saw a circle about 15 in diameter. It was also about 4 inches deep and 6 inches wide. Nothing was moved out of the way. Everything was pushed down with the dirt, including part of my campfire. It was about a foot from my tent. Needless to say, I packed my things and noped the hell out of there. This happened to me when I was 16 and still bothers me several years later. I've always had a weird sleep schedule, and when I was 15 to 16, it was very common for me to be up at 2 a.m. and later in the summer. One night, at around 3 o'clock, I decided to go outside into my backyard and get some fresh air since it was a warm night. At the time, I lived in the suburbs of southern Tennessee in a pretty run-down neighborhood. The house next to ours had been abandoned for a couple of years, and I always joked that it was cursed because 3 separate people had bought it, moved in, and then sold it and moved away again, all within the span of maybe 5 years before that. At this time, the house was unoccupied and had been for some time. While I was outside, I started listening to music on my MP3 player with my headphones on. After a while, I started hearing a growling or snorting noise that wasn't super loud but still managed to get past my headphones and my music. After pausing my music and listening for a minute, I realized it was coming from behind me, where the abandoned house was. It sounded like something pretty big was making the noise, and I figured maybe a large stray dog had gotten into the neighboring yard somehow. Since that yard and mine were separated by a tall, sturdy fence, I just ignored it and went back to my music. The noises continued periodically, and finally, after a while, I decided to just go over to the fence and find out what was making them. As I approached the fence, I heard rustling sounds from the other side, like something moving in the grass. Figuring now that it was almost definitely a stray dog, I leaned in close to the fence and looked through a crack in one of the boards. A pair of huge yellow eyes were staring directly back at me, at eye level with me. I kind of stood there frozen like an idiot for a few seconds, but then I heard the growling noise again, this time inches from my face, and that snapped me out of it. I turned and ran back into my house, locked the doors, and failed to sleep that night. The next day, I looked through the fence again to see if there was any logical explanation. Maybe it had been a dog standing on a table or a stack of boxes for some reason. But the yard was still totally bare, no boxes, no patio furniture, nothing. Whatever had looked at me was actually as tall as I was. I moved away years ago and never went back, so I have no idea how that house or that neighborhood are doing now, but for the rest of the time that I lived there, I deliberately ignored any and all weirdness from the other side of that fence. I was out with my friend and his older brother. We always seek out scary encounters, and there is this hike that always gives off bad vibes at night. We were set to head out there. We got out there and went through the trail and off trail. I never felt anything too worrisome. We headed out to the mine shaft, where water trails out from runoff. We sat there, and I never felt the bad vibes. Small steps next to me, but felt like it was in my mind. Until my friend felt something tug at his pocket. We decided to get up and go until we heard a rock rolling behind us and started sprinting away in fear. 2 of us fell, but we got up and hurried away. We headed to the car, and for some reason we didn't get in or even speak about keeping on. But we just walked by, and we knew this trailhead was a little farther down the road. And mid-walk, I pointed out that we didn't even speak about going to this trailhead. It felt like something was calling us. We got to the trail and moved 30 yards in, and my friend pointed out a curved tree. I remembered the native stories about them bending trees for water and trail markers. I started telling them about it, and keep in mind that this trail is called Native Lake and leads to a smaller lake. When I was telling them about the natives bending trees, the tree that was right next to it started to creak. No wind is blowing. We noticed this and, for some reason, stayed right next to it. And once I was done talking about the natives, wood cracking started occurring in certain spots. There was a small grass patch, and it sounded like something was taking small steps. And as these things were occurring, the tree had started creaking louder and louder. More footsteps and branches breaking. My friend turned the flashlight and saw a shadow man on the edge of his light range. We then started to feel worse vibes and decided to walk out. As we were walking, you could hear things moving in the bushes. And right before the exit, the sound of a rock being kicked across the floor occurred right in front of us, but no rock was there. We backed up but then hurried out. Throughout this time, our eyes were watering, and chills were constantly running through our bodies. I want to know if something could be trapped in that tree or if something was pulling us in with that tree to toy with us. About 2 weeks ago, I had a really scary experience, and my husband didn't believe me. Our puppy was barking to go outside to use the bathroom. It was about 4 or 5 a.m. I took him out back and stood on the steps of our deck because I didn't want my feet to get wet. My dog was using the bathroom when I looked up and saw something across the yard. It was slowly walking towards me, like one step at a time, and its eyes were super reflective of my phone's flashlight. I thought it was a deer, but its eyes were so tall and staring straight at me. And it wasn't running away but walking closer. I hurried the dog up, and we ran inside. I have recurring night terrors, so at first, my husband thought it was just that. But I was crying and shaking and could barely talk about it. He told me it was probably a deer, but I wasn't convinced. I refused to take the dog out after midnight, though. Next day, so, early this morning, about 5 a.m., the dog was barking, and my husband took him outside. Once again, my husband stood on the deck stairs. He didn't have his glasses, but he said that when he looked up, he saw something tall standing in the forest part of our backyard. He said he saw it walking slowly, like it was almost gliding. And he said that as soon as he noticed it, he got a nosebleed. My husband is typically prone to nosebleeds but hasn't had one since the season changed. He said he wanted to get a closer look but felt like he needed to go inside instead, like an instinct, so he ran in. My husband is a zookeeper, and he isn't really afraid of animals. He works with giraffes and elephants and says this creature was definitely bigger than a deer. We've been trying to find out what else it could be, but we're coming up with nothing. For reference, we live in eastern Pennsylvania. Me and my brother, who were about 12 and 8, respectively, I'm 28 now, had just moved into a brand new neighborhood on the far east side of Columbus, Ohio, like past New Albany, where the houses had basically been built in freshly or partially cut down woods. Well, me and him were being boys and exploring the new woods with us when a sapling tree fell like you would imagine a gorilla would do if it swung from it, but at the base of the tree was an albino looking lightly haired and humanoid, almost as if a chimp, a man, a gorilla, with a dash of insects? Mated, and its offspring were albino. Best way to describe it. And it had ruby red eyes, which were the only insect-like attribute about it, but we could see them from about 30 feet away. They shone in the sunlight. Me and my brother both looked at each other, only to find we had both stopped and looked in the direction of the sapling because an intense fear gripped us. But by the time we looked back, it was gone. It was completely silent, save for the sound of the broken tree, and naturally we flipped out and ran home. The next day we went back, and sure enough, that sapling was still broken like a monkey swung from it. To this day, I have no idea what we saw, and if I were alone, I probably would have chalked it up to a bright imagination after all these years. But from time to time, we both separately ask each other if we remember that day, and that's all we ever say about it. We aren't from a nutty family by any means, and we are both intellectual people. So, I don't know. I worked at a summer camp out in the middle of nowhere for a couple summers. Campers always left on Saturday, and a new group would arrive on Sunday. Late Saturday night, staff was having a bonfire. I snuck away to smoke a joint. I finish that, and start making my way back to where everyone else is. As I'm walking back, I hear a lot of movement, like something moving really fast in the woods near me. It sounds like it's moving towards me. To my left, there's a path that branches off and goes out to the road. As I pass the path, I look over and see something crossing the path at a sprint going in the opposite direction of me. It was too fast to be a person and too tall to be anything I've ever seen before. All I was able to see was a leg that was too long to be anything. I recognized that everything else was obscured by the trees. The leg looked like it was as tall as me and pale white. I start getting a little freaked out, so I start walking a little faster. As I'm about to reach the tree line and get into a more open area, I hear the movement again. This time faster than the first. And again, it's running towards me. I could hear it stop as soon as it reached the tree line behind me, followed by dead silence. Without looking back, I ran to the nearest building, which is where my bunk was. I sit down and try to calm myself. I'm thinking I'm just stoned, my imagination is probably just running wild, and it was a deer. No more than 5 minutes later, two friends come inside out of breath, looking like they just saw a ghost. They tell me they were smoking a cigarette out on the road when they saw a 10-foot tall all-white creature standing in the patch of woods where I had just heard it running. When I was very young, maybe around 5 or 6, we were at my grandparents' cabin on a lake in Otter Tail County. It was late at night, and everyone was asleep. I had woken up and decided to look out the window facing into the yard. The yard light was on, and under it stood a person. It wasn't the size of any of my family, and I stared at it for a little bit. Then, all of a sudden, it spread its arms, exposing bat-like wings. It wrapped itself in its wings and ran into the woods. I'm sure there's a simple explanation, like I was dreaming or it was one of my parents in a coat grabbing something from the car. But it felt real, and it scared me. I never told anyone about it, but I had trouble sleeping at that cabin for several years after. Every time I tried to sleep, the image of those enormous wings would keep me awake. I was tripping balls off an 8 of boomers when I made eye contact with a deer at 50 yards. I had a bottle of ice cold Fireball with me that I couldn't find a good pocket for in my jacket, so I started chatting with the deer about pockets and how if it were a kangaroo, it would be able to help me out. As we were shooting the shit, the bugger started walking towards me and got within 15 yards of me. I thought I was going to be able to pull it off the bottle when it stood up on its back legs. I was like, damn, maybe you could be a kangaroo. I took a step towards it, and it screamed like a woman in a slasher flick. I, of course, screamed back much the same way, and it leapt into the air before bounding off. I'm pretty sure I met the deer lady that day. I'm not sure if her scream was a good sign or not, but I'm glad she didn't decide to take me away. This happened to my brother last year when he and my family went camping in northern Idaho at a church camp. It's a camp for our tribe, so each family in the tribe has a cabin, and our family cabins are right at the exit of the camp, so no one is behind us. There are a few street lamps around the camp, but only one near our camp. My brother and my cousin were in our family kitchen cabin getting some marshmallows when they heard taps and scratches coming from behind the cabin. They got scared, ran out, and told my aunt, who's by the fire. She's super religious, unlike us, so her logic is that she's only afraid of God. She takes a flashlight, walks around the cabin, says there's nothing, and goes to bed. My brother and cousin stay up after the rest of our family goes to bed and just sit by the fire, talking. My brother said that in the middle of a conversation, he looked at my cousin, who had a terrified look on her face. He looked over and saw that across the street there's this really tall man dressed up in a suit just staring at them. Both of them decided to just run to the nearest tent that our other cousin was in. They stayed in there for the night, but something shook their tent, so they stayed up all night. The next night, when the families gathered by the fire, they told my aunts and grandmas what they saw. Now the fire is in between 3 big pine trees, and after everyone tells them they were probably just imagining it, they all hear these thumps from the trees. Everyone just got quiet, then changed the subject. My brother said that this wasn't the only weird thing that happened. Some days before or after this happened, he and 2 of his friends went to get high by the lake. The lakes are about a quarter of a mile away from the camp. They walk to the side where no one can see them smoke, and to the left is a huge prairie. As they walk, they hear a whistle that gets about 10 feet closer every few seconds. When it's right next to them, the whistle goes back to where it started. This continues the whole time they're there. As they smoke, an eagle comes and sits on a branch right next to them. One of my brother's friends wants to throw a rock at it for feathers, but my brother stops him because the eagle sat right between them and the whistle. That's about it for my brother's weird trip to the annual church camp. I try to get out of going as much as I can since I'm not Christian anymore, but all my years going as a kid, I never experienced anything weird there. I heard some ghost stories there, but none were evil, and sometimes people who go there when the camp isn't going on hear children playing. If there's something paranormal going on there, it has to have started recently. I think my brother experienced stick Indians since they try to take people away, but I wasn't there. If there's really something going on, I think some crazy kids messed with something they weren't supposed to be messing with. This happened to my uncle. On Christmas Eve 1994, he was riding his motorcycle with a friend on their way home from visiting my grandparents, who lived in a small village. It had rained like crazy the week before, the bridge on the main road had collapsed, so they had to take another route on a dirt road around the hill. They had been riding for a few minutes through the dark forest when suddenly something happened. My uncle hit the brakes so abruptly that they almost fell. Hundreds of monkeys were emerging from the bushes a few meters in front of them, making their way to the other side of the dirt road beyond the tree line. My uncle waited patiently until the last monkey disappeared behind the bushes. Just as he was about to start the engine, another monkey walked out of the bushes. This one, my uncle said, was unbelievably huge. Dark grayish and as tall as an adult. It was bulky, and it limped a little as it moved. It was walking upright, very slowly, towards the bushes. And suddenly, it stopped in the middle of the road. It turned its head around to look at my uncle. He said he had never felt so scared in his life before. The gigantic monkey stood there, still staring into his soul. There was a flash of intimidation and wisdom in its eyes that only comes with old age. And he could see that this beast knew that they were in its territory. My uncle could feel his friend shaking violently behind him. After what felt like minutes, the staring contest was finally over when the beast walked into the bushes to join its troop. He waited for a few more minutes until he was convinced no more monkeys were showing up and caught them off guard before they took off. When they finally made their way out of the forest onto the main road, his friend went, "What the hell was that?" My uncle was sure that that huge monkey they had just seen was the leader of the troop. It was just trying to make sure that its troop made it to the other side of the forest safely. But what scared him the most was that it never blinked while staring at him. It still gives him chills whenever he thinks about the frightening encounter. I was walking at night with a girl I just met, and she suddenly grabbed my arm really tight, pulled me back, and said, "Listen, we were walking down a dirt road near the woods, and we stopped. I actually heard something strange coming from the darkness in the woods." I brushed it off and told her not to worry, assuring her that she was safe with me, and that was the end of it. I still have no clue what it was, but it sounded like whispers coming from the woods. So I was just in the Olympic National Forest last night because I went to visit Forks. On my way back to Seattle, I was driving down Highway 101, and it was snowing a ton. It was super dark out, and I had stopped my car on the road for a moment, middle of nowhere, to look at the tall pine trees, which are gorgeous. It was really dark, but I took some pictures of the trees in night mode on my camera. And then I put my phone down and looked back out, and there was suddenly this weird, tall, skinny white/flash man-like creature perched up on a rotten log. It had no eyes but was facing me. Its arms were super long, in front of its body, while it crouched down. I obviously didn't stay long enough to look at what it might be, and it was really dark. I rolled up my car window, immediately left, and didn't get out of my car. It was like 50 miles from Forks in the direction of the Hoh rainforest, in the darkest part of the forest. While traveling back from Winnipeg to the PA, Manitoba, Canada. Me and a friend, George, went to Winnipeg for the night. The way to Winnipeg was normal, it took us 6 hours as usual. I've done this trip numerous times, as the PA is my hometown, which I've recently moved back to from Winnipeg. On the way back, the first 3-1/2 hours go by normally. I was driving the speed limit most of the time, as it was icy and snowing most of the time. So we come up to the turnoff, where Highway 6 turns off onto the 60, at about 4 p.m. This is where things got really strange. The first odd instance happened about 20 minutes later on this highway. A red van overtook us right before a right turn and rounded a sharp bend. When we came around the bend, the van had vanished, and it was a long straight high for a bit. I thought this was weird, but I didn't pay any mind to it, nor did I mention it to my friend. So we've been on the highway for 45 minutes. This highway takes about an hour until you get to the next turn off, which is 10, the final turn off en route to the PA. We drive for the next 20 minutes without words, just with the radio playing. Then my friend George made the comment, "Have you noticed there hasn't been any road signage?" I didn't realize it, but there were no signs indicating when a turn was coming up, nor were there any signs in regards to how far we are from towns in kilometers, no signs whatsoever. At this point, I noticed the sun hadn't moved an inch in the sky. On top of this, we haven't seen any other vehicles in a while. I thought this was a ducking strange man, and so did my friend. Unnerved, I sped up, going between 120 and 140 kilometers per hour. I started having this overwhelming feeling that something was ducking wrong. Then I noticed another anomaly among the other glaring things that are already making this experience really ducked up. All the trees were the same height, and the tree line was extremely dense, like a wall of trees. This was scary because I then realized this scenery was not at all what it should be. Where we were should have been a sparse tree line with small ponds and marshland on both sides of the highway. We've been on this highway for 2 hours now, the sun still hasn't moved, there are still no road signs, no traffic, and we're not where we should be. Me and George are stuck on this highway, and we're starting to get scared, trying to piece together and figure out what the duck is happening. Out of nowhere, the sun sets unnaturally fast, which takes maybe 2 minutes. We are enveloped in the darkness of a starless night without a moon. We got freaked out. 2 25-year-old men were pretty well shaken, and just when this ominous, oppressive feeling was unbearable, we came to the turnoff out of nowhere. 3 hours later, we were stuck on that ducking highway that takes barely over an hour to travel. But it didn't end there. Just when I thought we were returning to normality, I glanced in the rearview mirror, because I thought for the first time in 3 hours I'd seen headlights. I was wrong. In the backseat sitting behind me on the driver's side was a black human silhouette with glowing yellow eyes. George and I both saw it. I couldn't believe what we were experiencing. All of what happened is so unreal. The next hour and a half were terrifying and mostly set in silence. We finally pulled into the PA shortly before midnight. We were stuck for 2.5 hours in some sort of limbo with unreal anomalies that made no sense, and we were totally conscious and aware the whole time, making note of the time. To top it off, when we pulled into the PA, I noticed our gas barely moved. We are totally lost on an explanation of what happened. About 10 years ago, me and my best friend decided to stop by a local hangout of ours in Bowie, Maryland. We grew up here and spent our early years wandering the rail tracks and woods, smoking and drinking as children do. So this one spot is a railroad overpass at 450 and 197. There's a parking lot and a small area of grass and trees, so it's nighttime, and we decide to go there to smoke a cigarette. We're smoking and he's talking, but the entire time I'm focused to my right, peering down this track because I have the strangest feeling. I didn't know what it was until later, and it was the feeling of being watched by a predator, which I've never experienced before. After about 2 minutes, we're almost done with our cigarettes when a helicopter flies right above us, seemingly at tree level, with the spotlight going right over us coming from the direction of the overpass. Not 10 seconds later, I hear the gravel shift from between the tracks, and I look towards the overpass. Standing right in the center of the overpass, there is this giant silhouette. Now that it's dark and it's under the overpass, I can only see its silhouette. It's about 8 or 9 feet tall and burly looking. It was huge, and we only looked at it for about a second before I said, "Let's go now." Now we are hurriedly starting to rush away, and we hear the gravel move closer, and not 3 seconds later, we both hear the most demonic, horrifying, multiple-pitched screech literally right behind our heads. It came from no more than a foot behind us. So of course we booked it for his car, and no, we didn't look back. We get to his car, and we drive around for an hour. The only thing we could say is what the duck. Now, a week later, we're hanging out with our friend Andy. Andy has spent a lot of time in the woods, and he was telling us about how last week the cops were out in the woods because they heard screams and thought a woman was being attacked. Now I asked him if they had helicopters out, and he said yes, and I asked him what day it was, and it was the same night we saw the creature. So we told him our experience, and he was like, "Yeah, that was him, you saw the goat man." I live on the west coast of BC and Canada, about halfway up the coast. I was driving my girlfriend back to her granddad's house 2 towns over from mine, about a 2.5-hour drive on the highways. I had driven her home and spent the day visiting her family. I spent the day there and am now getting ready to drive back home. About 25 to 30 minutes into the drive, I'm on the highway that runs parallel to the mouth of the river on one side and the CN tracks on the other, so it goes rail on my left, the road I'm on, then the sort of mini channel where the river ends. I'm driving, it's getting dark, but I'm not tired or drowsy at all. There are a few rest stops along the road on my right, on the river bank. I need to piss, so I start slowing down at the first one, and something scurries across the road. And that's almost all that happened. It was, at least from what I saw, black. Like black and black. Like the unnaturally dark, there was no texture or anything to it, almost like a void of light or color in the shape this thing was. It ran out of the bush and over the rails. I was going slow enough that wind and highway noise were gone, and I heard it. It sounded like metal tapping as it ran over the ballast and rail. Then the sound of if you took a rod or rebar and stabbed it into the ground. Then metal again as it ran in front of me, across the road. Its body was shaped like how people describe a UFO. Almost flat disc shape. Like an oval stretched out with the legs protruding from the front and back. It had no features, no eyes, no face, no mouth, that I could see. I didn't see the bottom or front much. It ran across the road, its limbs stretching out as it ran. Then it ran into the rest area, over the bank, and, I'm guessing, into the river. I kept driving. I didn't piss until I got home 2 hours later. I've tried searching this up online, but I've never had any luck. And this thing was big. I mean, like, the size of a VW Beetle. Big and fast. My aunt told me this story. Back in the early 2000s, she had to commute from southwestern Colorado into New Mexico for a clinic once a month. She would leave late Friday night and drive through the night with her boss, who was teaching at the clinic. One of these nights she was driving through some reservation land, pitch dark besides what the headlights and moon could illuminate. She looks over to see if her boss is asleep, and just as she sees him out like a rock, she feels eyes on her just beyond the window. She looks out just to see something running alongside the car out in the field, loping almost on all fours with a sort of hunched back. She was going at least 50 miles per hour, but it stuck right by the car. As it ran, it angled its path to run right up next to the car, close enough for her to see the basic elements of a human face before it darted off out of sight. She waited for a long time to get far away before waking up her boss to switch seats, and she didn't speak about it for years. About 3 or 4 years ago, I was driving from York, Nebraska, going north on US 81. It's very early in the morning, maybe 2 or 3 a.m., without another car in sight. I remember the moon being bright and how the surrounding fields were illuminated well, considering there weren't any lights along the road. I'm somewhere around the Stromsburg area, knee-high cornfields on either side of me, with the occasional grove of trees scattered along the way. I momentarily take my eyes off the road to see a large white figure in the distance, standing in the field a few yards from the roadside. I slow down a bit, curious because I've traveled this road several times by this point without encountering anything before now, and as I near, I see a huge white dog of some kind, just standing there, watching my car as I approach it. I'm mystified and get goosebumps seeing this ghostly-looking animal illuminated by the moonlight at an ungodly hour, wondering whose giant-ass dog is roaming around in the dark this close to a highway. Normally I would stop to see if I could find a collar and tag on a dog without an owner, but this dog is not one I would want to mess with if it wasn't friendly. I take my eyes off the animal and back onto the road as I finally pass it, but when I look back, I can't see it anywhere. At the time, I didn't think anything of it, but looking back, the dog had been big enough to stand above the crops, so if it were still in the corn, I would have seen it. With an open highway and no trees close by, there weren't many places it could have hid. It's Nebraska, so at the time I was sure it was just a dog, or maybe some guy's wolf dog or something, but certainly not a wild wolf. I've since learned about skinwalkers, and though we do have native territories all throughout most of Nebraska, as far as I know, skinwalkers are a Navajo-specific legend. Plus, having been a Nebraskan for many years, the thought of the paranormal juxtaposed against cornfields is hard for me to believe. I've had 3 strange or scary encounters with huge white dogs in my lifetime, all coincidental and twice out of nowhere, so regardless, it's still a strange encounter in my life. When I was 20, I used to work as a pizza delivery guy in a small city in northern Germany. On my way home, I had to drive a few miles on a remote state street that led through forest and farmland. One night, it must have been around 1 a.m. there was a huge thunderstorm, and I had to drive slowly and carefully. When I came to a road junction, I noticed a figure standing in the middle of the road. It looked like a tall and slender man in a long black leather cloak with a hood. At first, I thought it was someone who had an accident and was looking for help, but when my headlights hit the figure, I noticed that the cloak, especially the hood, appeared to be empty. Also, my headlights did not illuminate the cloak like they should have. It was just the lightning reflecting on the smooth, wet surface that allowed me to see the shape. Of course, I floored the gas pedal and went as fast as I dared. A couple of miles later, I ran into the same or at least a very similar figure, again standing right in the middle of the road and not moving at all. This time, I didn't even slow down and rushed right past it. It scared me to death. A couple of weeks later, this time no thunderstorm, just a beautiful warm summer night, I encountered another creature right where I saw the black figure before. It looked like a giant deer, but without fur and pale gray or white skin. It was extremely skinny, almost skeletal-like, and had an abnormally long and thin tail. It ran alongside the road and kept pace with me quite easily as I drove past it. Only when I slammed the gas pedal and went suicidally fast did it start to fall behind and eventually disappear in a crop field. The very next day, I quit my job and never used that road at night again. This was in the 90s. I was at the park behind Park Place Mall, and there was this little desert area near where houses came up to the park. I was a kid walking near the desert area with my baseball glove and ball, just minding my business around dusk, and I suddenly felt this overpowering presence. I froze, and the hairs on my arms and neck stood up. I felt immense fear. It's kind of weird to explain, but I felt the presence grow, and I ran so fast across the park all the way to the other end with an uncontrollable sense of panic. I could feel that I was being chased, and it was so intense. I ended up running all the way home. I didn't have that same feeling once I left the park, but the sense of fear was still there. When I got home, my mom knew something was wrong. I told her what happened, and the next day she went up there alone, and if I remember correctly, she said there were mutilated rabbits and pentagrams just in the desert. She called the police, and I remember them telling her it was probably coyotes, and she yelled, "Coyotes made a pentagram." Sometimes when I run, I remember that feeling like I am being chased, and my hair stands up and I feel really fear. It's like a physical memory my body has. It's definitely not as intense. Another day in 2017, at my house on the east side, I got out of the shower and heard my German Shepherd and Chihuahua barking in a way they didn't usually bark. It was more ferocious and was almost like they were throwing their barks at something. I looked out the bathroom window, and this ducking humongous wolf-looking dog came flopping over my 6-foot wall like it was nothing. I'm standing totally still and quiet, and it looks at me for a few seconds from across the yard. It almost looked animated with the way it moved. My dogs continued to bark at it from a few feet away, and it changed its focus to them looking at them and stepping snowing towards them. This thing was probably 3 times larger than my 70-pound German Shepherd. I ran as fast as I could to the back door to help my dogs, and as I got to the door, this thing just turned and looked at me. Now it has floppy ears and more velvety looking skin instead of fur. I go to open the door, and the thing climbs over the wall like a person, like a velvety gray person with floppy dog ears. It used its front paws as hands to pull itself up and its feet and knees to jump up and climb over. I didn't know what to think. I stood there for a minute and finally called my dogs over and put them in the house. I went over and looked in my alley, and there was no sign of it anywhere. My old man worked up at the border of Washington and Canada for law enforcement. Sensors had been going off all week along a known smuggling route. He, 3 guys, and an attack dog went up to the area to set up for the night. They get to the trail and drop off 2 agents and the dog on one side, then they drive around to the other side, where they set up for the night. A couple hours in, they get radioed by their coworkers to come back over and pick them up. They arrive back with the other agents and get out of the car. These guys are scared shitless, saying something is on top of the ridge. My dad and the other guy are giving the 2 guys that called them shit. Within minutes, they stopped giving those guys shit. It started off with large rocks or logs being rolled down the hill. Then they heard it, a screaming howl that my dad, an avid hunter and outdoorsman, had never heard in his life. This thing barrels down the mountain, covering a couple hundred meters, only to stop 30 to 50 meters in front of them behind a bush. The attack dog with them instantly went behind its handler. All they could see was this unknown animal's eyes piercing through the bush. All 4 got in the car and left absolutely terrified. Old man said he wasn't saying it was Bigfoot, but without a doubt in his mind, it was an animal he had never seen or heard before. From the rolling of rocks and logs to the screaming howl and the absolute speed it came down the ridge, plus, what police attack dog cowers behind its handler? They don't know what they ran into that night, but he wasn't ruling out Bigfoot either. So this happened to me a few years ago. I was visiting a friend's house in the Houston River area. That section of the river is pretty swampy, so we were frog hunting at night. It was a full moon, so it made spotting the bullfrogs easier. Super tasty, BTW. Anyway, we're wandering down by the river bank when we heard sound. All went quiet, not even the crickets chirped. We heard dozens of frogs dive into the water, and we knew then that something was very wrong. Then came a distant growl, like something evil, from the other side of the river. We killed our Q-beam spotlight and watched in the direction of the sound. What I saw chilled me to the bone. It was like a massive wolf with patchy black fur, yet no visible skin on its head, only a skull with empty eyes. It appeared to be locked onto other prey, so we shut our lights off and watched for a moment. Looking back, it was really stupid to not flee right then. It ran back into the woods and started running down the river. We decided to dip out and get as far away as possible. I have lived in the Appalachian Mountains all my life and have experienced a lot of strange things. My family was Irish and settled in WV, but I currently live in the NC portion of these wonderful mountains. That being said, I have learned a lot about what really lurks in these dark woods, but this was like nothing I had ever experienced before. It all began with my golden retriever, Ozzy, growling like I had never heard before. He literally never growls, so that had me already uncomfortable, but this growl was bone-chilling. It was like he was getting ready to have to fight for his life or something. I took both him and my other dog out at around 11 p.m., and he would not leave my side. I noticed that my workshop door was open, so I walked down to close it and lock it up. The entire time, he was glued to my side. Ozzy also kept trying to get in between my legs, still growling, and all of his hair stuck straight up like a feral animal. The second I closed the door, all hell breaks loose in the woods. It sounded like 50 full-grown men had broken out into a full sprint, tearing through the woods. Trees were shaking, and branches were falling. In my life, I have never been that scared. We got back in the house before I shitted my pants, and I got my pistol and mag light to figure out what the hell was out there. When the dog and I got back outside, we were surrounded by what sounded like people mumbling. It was everywhere. I shone the light all over the woods and couldn't see anything, but the sound was coming from all around. It sounded as if you had a full gym of people to baby mumble. You could almost make out words. That's why I don't think it was an animal. I almost immediately felt sick, like I was having a mix between a panic attack and the full swing of the flu. Back inside the house, it sounded like people were walking around all night. The windows were creaking, and you could clearly hear the sound of shoes on gravel. The mumbling never stopped. Every time I got up to check the house, my feet would touch the floor, and it would get dead silent. You couldn't hear birds, crickets, frogs, or anything. I was terrified and didn't sleep a wink. The air felt thick and evil all night. That's the only way I could explain the feeling. Imagine a soaking wet quilt being tossed over you. That's how I felt. This took place over 10 years ago in Snowdon Park Loop, Minden Hills, Ontario, Canada. It's pretty soggy and boggy around there, but there is a little hiking loop trail that circumvents the muckier parts. Besides, it was March, so the ground was still pretty frozen and easy to traverse. My wife and I and our dog were along on the trail and had just headed out on the 6K loop when our dog got a little too far out on the ice of one of the ponds, crashing through the thin ice into the water. We yelled in fear, worried that she might get carried under the ice and out of reach. Thankfully, it was only shoulder-high water on her, so we were able to carefully lift her off and whisk off the water. No sooner had we recovered our dog than a new terror came to us, a deep, dreadful growl from everywhere and nowhere. We stopped momentarily, thinking we were hearing things, and then it came again, louder this time and seeming to take up every ounce of our eardrums. Now I've been in the wild in many places, including Kruger National Park in South Africa, and I can say that the feeling was similar to hearing a male lion calling out to his pride. The closest audio reference would be the part in 1986 Ghostbusters when Rick Moranis gets possessed by the spirit and growls at those guys, turning his eyes red. It was deep, hair-raising, and unholy, and it definitely did not want us there. I've gone through every animal it could have been, from a hibernating bear to a moose, which are common there. The thing is that we heard no crashing or thrashing that you would get from a bear. We had seen a deer a few moments before, and it made some pretty loud noises as it leapt away. The sound just happened. The feeling it welled up inside us gave us the sense that it didn't want us there, so we grabbed our dog and turned on our heel back to our car's top speed. I know that there are tales of the Wendigo and indigenous stories from there. I live in northeast Mississippi, and my family has seen something matching this description 3 times, about 6 years ago. We found the Alabama white thing online, so now we've been calling ours the Mississippi white thing. For what it's worth, we live about 10 miles from the Natchez Trace. All the sightings happened in the evening. The first sighting happened right up next to our house. Myself, my son, and our dogs all saw it. Well, I don't know what the dogs saw, but they saw something, lost their minds, and started barking, which caused my son and I to look out the windows and see it run down the sidewalk in front of our house and towards the woods. By the time we got out the front door, it was nowhere to be seen. A week later, my husband was sitting on the front porch when he saw it exit the woods, run down the road, and into the woods across the street. About a month later, he saw it at the edge of the woods, straight across from the house. Size of an adult male human, maybe 6 feet, bipedal, and inhumanly fast. My wife and I just saw a tall, white creature around 1:30 a.m. We work in Hohenwald, Tennessee, and were coming home from work driving up a road called Natchez Trace. Whatever it was tall and fast as hell. I've never seen anything move that fast. It jumped completely over the road. The weirdest part was that it stopped, and we could see it looking at us from the tree line. Had almost human-looking eyes but were bigger and reflected light like an animal's eyes. It was standing, and we could see its eyes, but it was definitely trying to stay out of sight. It didn't really look like what I would imagine a Bigfoot, I don't believe in Bigfoot anyway, would look like. Maybe more slender, but it moved too quickly to get an accurate description, of course. It seems to be how it goes with strange sightings. It's extra strange because when I was a kid, my grandparents and I witnessed a white creature messing with their chicken coop. It was also tall and fast. Now we're sitting at home, freaking the duck out. A few years ago, my 3 friends and I went camping in south-central Minnesota in a town called Frontenac. One night, we were settling into the tent to sleep when we heard coyotes howling in the distance. We didn't think much of it and turned off the light to go to sleep. I couldn't seem to fall asleep, so I lay awake listening to the coyotes and the bugs, among other night noises. Suddenly, in the distance, I heard this strange, low call that had the coyotes on high alert. The sound steadily came closer, and the coyotes suddenly fell silent, as did the insects. Our campsite was just off a dirt road, and when the sound came from right outside our site, I could also hear something large shifting around on the gravel and dirt. Eventually it turned and went back the way it came, and when we couldn't hear its calling anyone, the coyotes started howling again, and the bugs returned. The next day, I searched for every Minnesota native animal I could think of and listened to their different calls. Nothing matched what I'd heard. When I asked the ranger if a bear or some other large animal might have come through, he said it was possible but highly unlikely since most large animals avoid the people at the campground. Eventually I let my imagination run wild and listened to Sasquatch calls, and sure enough, it sounded just like some of the recordings. I also searched the area and found that Sasquatch sightings are somewhat common in Frontenac and the surrounding towns. Back in 2011, I wanted to do some night photography, like the horizon with stars and Milky Way stuff. I had my nephew and a friend who was weird in a cool way. Dude was into all kinds of weird shit, like peyote and lucid dreaming. Anyway, he guides me east on the 60th, I honestly don't remember where, but we pulled off onto a dirt road off the highway. It was dark, but we followed it up this mountainside onto a small area that seemed like a small, clear valley. While I was setting up my camera gear, like a tripod, lenses, and stuff, my nephew and my friend were trying to light up a cigarette. They couldn't find their lighter, so they were digging through their pockets. I was bending down and setting up my tripod when, all of a sudden, we heard what sounded like a stampede coming down from the north side of the valley. I could only describe it as people in sandals. It had that barefoot sound to it. And it wasn't like 2 or 3 people. It sounded like there was 50 or 100, enough to where we could feel the floor vibrating. All 3 of us looked at each other, and we all had fear in our eyes, like we were about to get stampeded and ducked up. Simultaneously, we started running towards the car. I picked up my camera stuff, threw it in the trunk, and we stood by the doors, ready to get in, and it just kept coming so close, like they were just 5 feet away in the bushes. Then it just stopped. It was silent. We got in and left, scared. I didn't say a word till we got on the highway. I have lost all desire to do night photography to this day. My wife and I recently bought her grandparents' estate in a rural community. The house is on a great plot of land with a forest surrounding it on 3 sides. I was working on the tree line on the property, which had become infested with invasive plants, Asian honeysuckle, etc., and fallen dead tree limbs. While I was taking the dead tree limbs to the brush pile, I noticed something weird. I saw what I thought was a large flying insect, but if it was, it's one I haven't witnessed before. It looked like an insect, but the wings didn't come from the thorax, middle, like all insects around here. Also, a recent cold snap has grounded most flying insects. The wings were at the top, and it looked like it was almost sitting crisscross applesauce style. I watched it hover and float, and I was expecting it to land, but it simply disappeared. I majored in invertebrate biology, and it's not anything I've observed before or researched when looking at bugs native to the forest. I am trying to be a good steward of the property, and I don't want to piss anything off. Am I crazy? I remember I used to live in this 100-plus-year-old house, and the basement smelled like sulfur and something rotting. One night, or morning, I guess, it was 3:15 a.m., and I heard the doorknob moving up and down, like someone was trying to come in my room. Me, being half awake, went and opened the door, only to see no one there. I shut it back and went back to my bed. As soon as I was in bed, I heard something scratching at the foot of my bed. I covered myself with the blankets and tried to ignore them. My lamp on my bedside table launched across the room and shattered everywhere. And then I remember passing out after that. I woke up the next morning to everything being back the way it was, but my mom had a weird dream that I was eaten by a demon. I take care of my friend's dog when she goes out of town. The dog is a mini Aussie Shepherd. She is super sweet and extremely active, so she needs, wants, 2 long walks a day. You can't say the W word without her barking and jumping in excitement. She loves her walks. I'm able to take her on extra long walks on the weekends because I have no work. So I had a long walk planned through downtown and around TCC. So we're on Cushing Street, early in the walk, going great. Then, in front of Coronet, she just stopped in her tracks. I thought she found something interesting to sniff. But she was just staring forward down the sidewalk, nose forward, with one of her paws up, like a hunting dog would. There was no one or nothing on the sidewalk in front of us that I could see. I couldn't gather what she was looking at. We walked that same path a lot. I ask, "What is wrong? Let's go," and pull on her leash. She wouldn't budge. Then suddenly, she just nopes out and starts walking fast in the opposite direction. I let the leash go slack and just followed her. She goes straight back to my house. When we get inside, I take off her leash. She's calm, but she goes right into her crate and lays down. I couldn't get her out of the crate to go potty or drink water. She just laid there for the rest of the night. In the morning, she was normal. I take her for a walk and take her right down Cushing Street again. She didn't react at all. It was a fun, normal walk. I don't know what the hell she saw. This story was told to me by my uncle, who swears it really happened. He was the only one in the family to whom this happened, so no one else could hear his story. I don't know if I believe this myself. In 1979, there was a 12-year-long civil war in El Salvador. My uncle was in the military. He was sent to the woods or jungle with like 6 other guys to go look for militia groups that we were supposedly camping out there. After walking in the woods or jungle for hours, they suddenly felt the ground shake as if something big was coming towards them. He described it like in Jurassic Park, when the T-Rex was coming towards them and the water rippled. He said they thought it was the enemy doing something, so they hid. He said that he was shocked when he saw a giant. He said it was walking in the distance. I asked him if it was just maybe a really big person like Bigfoot, and he said no. It was more of a Jack and the Beanstalk kind of giant. He said there were trees blocking the view somewhat, but that he could make out that it was like a really big human. He said it was as tall as the tallest tree there. He said he tried to get a good look at it, but he was terrified and didn't want to get out of hiding when he realized what it was. He said the giant basically just walked past them. He said they were all terrified and waited there for a while, as they were scared to bump into another one. He said 2 of the guys suggested trying to kill it to get rich, but the guy in charge told them to stand down. My uncle said everyone thought they were idiots for suggesting such a thing. He said they walked back to base as quickly and quietly as possible. They told everyone, but when they got back, no one believed them. They were friends with the pilots. And the pilots called bullshit on their story because they fly over the jungle all the time and would have seen such a creature, especially if it was as tall as the trees as they claimed. He said all of the guys described what they saw. One guy claimed that it appeared bald. Another guy said he thought it had some sort of loincloth like Tarzan. My uncle emphasized that he didn't get a good look. And all he knows is that the ground is shaking as if some really big creature is coming towards them. He saw what appeared to be a giant human walking in the distance. He got down, hid, and waited till it was gone. I began to ask him things like, if it were real, don't you think they would have found a body or some bones of something that big? Especially since El Salvador is so tiny in relation to other parts of the world. He responded along the lines of, I don't know about none of that stuff, I just know what I saw that day.